My boyfriend broke up with me after I paid for all his medical school, and once he became a doctor, he said I was just a broke loser. I never thought I'd be telling this story, but here I am, 3 years later, and I finally feel ready to share what happened. My name is Carol, and this is about how I learned that sometimes the biggest mistake you can make is loving someone more than you love yourself. It all started during my sophomore year at community college. I was 19, working part-time at a local diner called Murphy's, saving every penny I could for my nursing program. The place was always packed with college students, but there was this one guy who came in every Tuesday and Thursday night, always ordering the same thing: black coffee and whatever was cheapest on the menu. His name was David, and he had this way of studying that fascinated me. While other students chatted loudly or scrolled through their phones, he was completely absorbed in his medical textbooks, highlighting passages and taking notes in the margins. His clothes were worn but clean, and he always left exactly 15% tip, calculated to the penny. One particularly slow Thursday, I finally worked up the courage to talk to him. "Pre-med?" I asked, refilling his coffee cup for the third time that evening. He looked up with these tired brown eyes and nodded. "First year at State, trying to get into medical school next year." There was something vulnerable in his voice, like he wasn't sure he believed it himself. We started talking, and I learned that David was supporting himself entirely through school. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 17, leaving him with nothing but debt. He worked construction during summers and weekends, his hands permanently stained and calloused from the work. Every dollar went toward tuition, books, and his tiny studio apartment near campus. I found myself looking forward to those Tuesday and Thursday conversations. He told me about his dream of becoming a surgeon, how he'd grown up watching medical shows and knew from age 10 that he wanted to save lives. I shared my own dreams of becoming a registered nurse, maybe specializing in pediatrics. We both understood what it meant to work for everything we had. 3 months into our friendship, something shifted. It was a cold February night, and David came in looking more defeated than usual. He slumped into his regular booth and just stared at his textbook without reading. When I asked what was wrong, he told me he might have to drop out. His construction job had ended for the winter, and he was $3,000 short for next semester's tuition. "The payment's due in 2 weeks, he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I've applied for every scholarship, every loan. Nothing came through." I watched this brilliant, hardworking man crumble, and something inside me broke. I had been saving for 2 years, living with my aunt to avoid rent, walking everywhere to save on gas. I had exactly $4,000 in my savings account, my entire nursing school fund. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I told David I wanted to help him, that I believed in his dream. He protested at first, said he couldn't accept my money, but I convinced him it wasn't charity. It was an investment in our future together. Because somewhere between those late-night conversations and watching him fight for his dreams, I had fallen completely in love with him. The next day, I withdrew $3,000 from my account and handed it to David. The look of relief and gratitude in his eyes made every sacrifice feel worth it. He hugged me tight and promised he'd pay me back as soon as he could, that he'd never forget what I was doing for him. "We're a team now," he whispered into my hair. "When I'm Dr. David Martinez, you'll be right there beside me." I believed him completely. I believed in us. In the future, we were going to build together. I had no idea that I had just made the most expensive mistake of my life. David got accepted to medical school that fall, and I had never seen anyone so happy. He called me crying, saying he couldn't have done it without me. We celebrated at Murphy's with coffee and pie, planning our future like we were already married. He'd be a doctor, I'd finish nursing school, and we'd work at the same hospital. It felt like a fairy tale beginning, but fairy tales don't prepare you for reality. Medical school was expensive, really expensive. Even with student loans, David was struggling to cover everything. Books alone cost over $1,000 each semester, plus lab fees, equipment, and living expenses. His loan money barely covered tuition. I made another decision that seemed logical at the time. I deferred my nursing program and picked up a second job. Mornings at a retail store called Fashion Forward, evenings at Murphy's. I was working 60 hours a week, coming home exhausted, but every paycheck went toward David's education. Textbooks, lab coats, stethoscope, even groceries when his loan money ran short. "It's temporary," I kept telling myself and my Aunt Rosa, who watched me with growing concern. "Once he's established, I'll go back to school." Rosa would shake her head and mutter in Spanish about men who take advantage, but I brushed off her warnings. She didn't understand our love story. David was grateful, always grateful. He'd study at my apartment, surrounded by medical journals and anatomy charts, while I heated up discount frozen dinners for both of us. Sometimes he'd look up from his books and say, "Carol, I don't know how to thank you. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making this up to you." Those words sustained me through the exhaustion and the mounting sacrifice. My social life disappeared entirely. Friends from high school stopped inviting me out because I never had money or time. I wore the same 5 outfits to work, rotating them to avoid looking too obvious. My Aunt Rosa started buying groceries without telling me, claiming she'd bought too much so I wouldn't feel like charity. Meanwhile, David was thriving. His grades were excellent, professors noticed him, and he was making friends with classmates who seemed to come from a different world than ours. Sometimes he'd mention study groups at someone's apartment, describing places with granite countertops and parents who were doctors or lawyers. I felt proud that my boyfriend was smart enough to belong in those circles. The hardest part wasn't the money or the exhaustion. It was watching David change, subtly at first. He started using medical terminology in regular conversation, correcting people's pronunciation of health-related words. He bought new clothes for school, saying he needed to look professional for clinical rotations. Somehow, my thrift store finds suddenly weren't good enough for study dates with his new classmates. "You should dress better when you come to campus events," he said one day. Not meanly, just matter of fact. First impressions matter in medicine. I nodded and agreed, secretly calculating how many extra shifts I'd need to afford something nice. I ended up wearing the same black dress to every medical school function, hoping no one would notice. During his second year, the requests became more frequent. Could I cover his car insurance so he could focus on studying? Could I pay for his board exam prep course? Each time I said yes, transferring money from my dwindling savings or picking up extra shifts. I was living on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, but David needed to eat well to maintain his energy for studying. "You're investing in our future," he'd remind me, and I believed him. I calculated that by the time he finished residency, I'd have invested about $40,000 in his education. It seemed like a lot, but doctors made good money. We'd pay off his loans together, buy a house. Maybe I'd finally go back to school. Rosa's comments became more pointed. "Mija, when is he going to invest in your future?" she'd ask. I'd get defensive, explaining that medical school was demanding, that David barely had time to sleep, let alone work. She'd purse her lips and change the subject, but I could see the worry in her eyes. By David's 4th year of medical school, something fundamental had shifted between us, though I was too in love to see it clearly. He had started doing clinical rotations at the university hospital, working alongside attending physicians and residents who came from money. Their conversations weren't just about medicine. They talked about ski trips to Colorado, their parents' vacation homes, internships their fathers had arranged through connections. David began staying after hours, not just for medical reasons, but for the social aspects. "Networking is crucial in medicine," he'd explain when he came home at midnight from another study session. I'd be waiting with dinner reheated for the 3rd time, and he'd barely look up from his phone as he ate, scrolling through messages from classmates I'd never met. The first real warning sign came when his classmate Josh invited him to a formal dinner at some upscale restaurant downtown. David mentioned it casually, then asked if I had something appropriate to wear. I showed him my black dress, the same one I'd worn to every medical school event for 2 years. His face fell slightly. "Actually, maybe you should sit this one out," he said, not meeting my eyes. "It's mostly going to be medical talk anyway. You'd probably be bored." I felt a strange hollow feeling in my chest, but nodded understandingly. Of course he needed to focus on his career. I wasn't hurt, just disappointed. These exclusions became more frequent. Department parties, study group dinners, networking events. Somehow I was never quite appropriate for any of them. When I asked about his new friends, David would give vague answers. "You wouldn't have much in common with them," he'd say. "They're all about medical careers and research." I started noticing other changes, too. David would criticize the apartment we shared, mentioning how Josh's place had better lighting for studying, or how another classmate had a quiet home office. He'd complain about my work clothes hanging in the closet next to his suits, saying the smell from Murphy's kitchen lingered on everything. "When you go back to school, you should consider something more substantial than nursing," he said one evening while reviewing flashcards. "Maybe business administration or healthcare management, something that would complement my career better." I agreed enthusiastically, though privately I wondered when I'd have time or money for any degree program. The conversations about our future became shorter and less detailed. Instead of "when we buy our house," David started saying, "when I establish my practice." Instead of "our wedding," he'd mention "settling down eventually." I told myself he was just stressed about residency applications, but the shift felt permanent. One particularly painful evening, I overheard him talking to someone on the phone, probably Josh or one of his other new friends. "Yeah, I'm basically supporting myself through school," he was saying. "It's been tough, but I've made it work." I stood frozen in the kitchen, holding the box of pasta I'd bought for dinner. Supporting himself? What about the $42,000 I'd calculated I'd given him over 3 years? What about my 2 jobs? My deferred dreams? My ramen noodle dinners? When he hung up, I didn't say anything. I just cooked dinner in silence, wondering when I'd become invisible in my own relationship. David ate quickly, studying at the same time, and didn't notice my red eyes, or the way I kept touching the engagement ring my aunt had given me, the one I'd been secretly hoping he'd replace with a proposal. "I have to study late tonight," he said, gathering his books. "Josh's study group is meeting at his place." I nodded and started clearing dishes, watching him pack up his expensive medical texts. Texts I'd helped buy. As he headed toward the door, I finally found my voice. "David, when do you think I'll be able to go back to school?" The question hung in the air between us. He paused with his hand on the doorknob, and for a moment I thought he might turn around, might remember all the sacrifices I'd made. Instead, he sighed like I was asking for something unreasonable. "Carol, let's be realistic. Medical school is demanding, and residency will be even worse. Maybe once I'm established, we can look into it." Then he was gone, leaving me alone with the dishes and a growing certainty that established would never come. Graduation day arrived on a perfect May morning, and I had never been more proud or more heartbroken at the same time. I used my employee discount at Fashion Forward to buy a new dress. Navy blue with small flowers, nothing fancy but clean and pressed. I wanted to look perfect for David's big day, the day we'd been working toward for 4 years. I got to the ceremony early and found a seat in the middle section, close enough to see David's face when they called his name, but not close enough to embarrass him in front of his new friends. His parents had driven up from Texas. I'd helped pay for their hotel room, though David had asked me to book it under his name for simplicity. When they called David Martinez, Doctor of Medicine, my heart swelled with pride and something else. Relief. Maybe that we'd finally made it. I clapped harder than anyone, tears streaming down my face as he walked across that stage. All those double shifts, all those ramen dinners, all those nights falling asleep alone while he studied, it had led to this moment. But when David came down from the stage, diploma in hand, he went straight to his parents and his study group friends. I watched from my seat as Josh clapped him on the back, as classmates I'd never met hugged him and posed for pictures. David was laughing, radiant, surrounded by people in expensive suits and designer dresses. I felt invisible. Finally, he spotted me and waved me over. "Carol, come meet everyone." His voice was cheerful but distant, like I was a family friend rather than the person who'd sacrificed everything for this moment. I walked over awkwardly, conscious of my discount dress among all the designer outfits. "This is Carol," David said to the group, his hand barely touching my elbow. "She's been very supportive during school." Supportive. 4 years of my life, $43,000 of my money, and I was supportive. Josh smiled politely and immediately turned back to David to discuss residency programs. The other classmates made brief small talk before gravitating back to their own conversations. David's mother hugged me warmly. She at least remembered what I'd done for her son. "Mija, we can never thank you enough," she whispered in my ear. But David was already moving away, pulled into another conversation about his surgery residency at Metropolitan General Hospital. At the graduation party that evening, held at some upscale restaurant Josh's parents had rented out, I felt like a ghost. David barely spent 5 minutes with me the entire night. He was networking, he explained when I finally cornered him near the bar. "These connections are crucial for my career, Carol. You understand, right?" I understood. I understood that after 4 years of supporting his dreams, I didn't rate 5 minutes of his attention on the most important night of his professional life. I understood that the classmates he'd been spending time with saw me as the working-class girlfriend who didn't quite fit. Most painfully, I understood that David saw me that way too. The ride home was quiet. David was tired, he said, and needed to rest before starting his residency orientation next week. I stared out the window at the city lights, thinking about all the plans we'd made that seemed to be dissolving without discussion. When would we get married? When would I go back to school? When would David remember that there was supposed to be an us in this success story? "I'm proud of you," I said as we pulled into our apartment complex. David smiled, the first genuine smile he'd given me all day. "Thanks, Carol. I couldn't have done it without you." But even as he said the words, they felt hollow, obligatory, like something you say to a helpful colleague, not to the person who'd given up everything for your dream. That night, as David fell asleep easily beside me, probably dreaming of surgical procedures and hospital hierarchies, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. For the first time in 4 years, I let myself think the thought I'd been pushing away. What if David's success had nothing to do with our future together? What if I'd just been a convenient source of funding for someone who was always planning to leave me behind? The graduation party had shown me a truth I wasn't ready to face. David had already moved into a world where I didn't exist. All those nights I'd stayed home while he networked. All those events I wasn't appropriate for. All those conversations about his future that never included me. They had been preparation for this moment. The moment when Dr. David Martinez no longer needed Carol the waitress. David's residency at Metropolitan General Hospital began in July, and with it came a whole new level of distance between us. Surgery residents worked brutal hours, 12 to 16-hour shifts, sometimes sleeping at the hospital for days straight. I understood the demands of medical training, but what I didn't understand was why David seemed relieved by the separation. The few hours he was home, David was either sleeping or on his phone with other residents. They'd discuss cases, complain about attending physicians, and plan rare social gatherings that somehow never included me. "It's just medical stuff," he'd say when I asked about his conversations. "You wouldn't be interested." But I caught glimpses of these conversations, and they weren't always about medicine. I heard him laughing about restaurants I'd never been to, mentioning weekend trips to some resident named Alicia's family cabin, discussing wine tastings and cultural events that happened in a world far removed from Fashion Forward and Murphy's Diner. "Why don't I ever meet your resident friends?" I asked one evening when David came home from what he'd called a department meeting, but which had clearly involved alcohol based on the smell on his breath. "Carol, you work 2 jobs and you're always tired," he said, loosening his tie. "Besides, most of the residents are focused on their careers right now. The conversations are pretty intense. Medical ethics, research opportunities, career trajectories. I don't think you'd enjoy it." The implication stung. I wasn't smart enough, educated enough, ambitious enough for his new peer group. Never mind that I'd been supporting his ambitions for 4 years while sacrificing my own. Somehow I'd become the limitation in his success story rather than the foundation it was built on. Money became a constant source of tension. David's resident salary was modest but steady, about $45,000 a year. For the first time since medical school started, he had regular income. I assumed this meant I could finally cut back on my hours, maybe take some evening classes to restart my education. Instead, David informed me that resident life came with new expenses. "I need professional clothes for hospital functions," he explained, showing me a catalog of designer suits. "And I have to contribute to department social events. Plus, there are medical conferences I should attend for networking." Each item he pointed to cost more than I made in a month at either of my jobs. I kept working 60-hour weeks, now funding David's professional wardrobe and conference fees instead of textbooks and tuition. The goalposts had moved again, and I was too exhausted to protest effectively. "Once I finish residency and start making real money, we'll get everything sorted out," David promised. But "we" was starting to feel like he in all his future plans. The worst part was watching David change around his new colleagues. One evening, I stopped by the hospital to bring him dinner during a long shift. The security guard directed me to the resident lounge, where I found David laughing with 3 other residents, 2 men and a woman with perfect blonde highlights and scrubs that somehow looked designer. "David!" I called, holding up the bag of food from our favorite Thai place. The conversation stopped abruptly. David looked uncomfortable, like I'd walked into the wrong room. "Hey, Carol," he said, walking over quickly. "You didn't need to come all the way down here." But I could see the embarrassment in his eyes, the way he positioned himself between me and his colleagues, the forced casualness in his voice. "This must be the famous Carol," said the blonde woman, Dr. Alicia Chen, according to her name tag. Her smile was polite but assessing, taking in my fashion-forward uniform and tired appearance. "David's told us so much about you." Had he? Because David had told me almost nothing about her, despite mentioning her name constantly in his phone conversations. I tried to smile back, but the dynamic was clear. I was the girlfriend who brought food, not the equal partner in David's success story. "I should get back," David said quickly, taking the food bag. "Thanks for this, Carol. I'll see you at home later." It was a dismissal, gentle but unmistakable. As I walked back to the elevator, I could hear the conversation resume behind me, David's voice losing the strained politeness it had held while I was there. That night, David came home at 3 a.m. and slipped into bed without waking me. I lay there in the dark, pretending to sleep, and finally acknowledged the truth I'd been avoiding for months. David was ashamed of me. After everything I'd sacrificed, after 4 years of being his biggest supporter, I had become an embarrassment to the man I loved. The end came on a rainy Thursday in March, during David's 3rd year of residency. I should have seen it coming, but you never really prepare yourself for the moment someone destroys your life with such calculated cruelty. David had been increasingly irritable for weeks, snapping at me over small things like leaving dishes in the sink or asking about his schedule. He'd started staying at the hospital even when he wasn't on call, claiming he needed to study for his board certification exams. Our conversations had dwindled to logistics, bills, schedules, who would pick up groceries. That Thursday, I got home from my double shift exhausted and soaked from the rain. David was already there, pacing around our small living room with manic energy. For a moment, I felt hopeful. Maybe he wanted to talk. Maybe we could finally address the distance that had grown between us. "We need to discuss our future," he said without preamble, not even asking about my day or noticing that I was dripping wet. I sat down on our secondhand couch, suddenly nervous. "I've been thinking about my career trajectory," David continued, still pacing. "I'll finish residency next year, and I'm looking at fellowship opportunities. Cardiothoracic surgery, probably in Boston or New York. The connections I'd make there would set me up for life." "That sounds amazing," I said carefully. "When would we move?" David stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, almost clinical. "Carol, there is no we in this scenario. I think it's time we both faced reality." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've outgrown this relationship," he said, his voice taking on a tone I recognized from when he talked to patients' families. Professional, detached, final. "Look at yourself, Carol. Look at your life. You're 26 years old, and what do you have to show for it? You work 2 dead-end jobs. You never finished any kind of degree. You have no professional aspirations beyond maybe nursing school someday." I stared at him, my mouth open. "David, I gave up school to support your dreams. I've been working 2 jobs to pay for your education, your clothes, your conferences. Nobody forced you to make those choices," he cut me off harshly. "Those were your decisions. I never promised you anything in return. I never asked you to sacrifice your own goals. You said we were a team." My voice cracked, 4 years of suppressed hurt finally breaking through. "You said you'd spend your life making it up to me." David laughed. Actually laughed. A sound so cold it made me recoil. "Carol, be realistic. Do you really think I can build the kind of medical practice I want with a girlfriend who smells like French fry grease? Do you think the department heads and hospital board members want to socialize with someone who shops at thrift stores?" Each word was like a knife. "I shop at thrift stores because I spent all my money on you. And that was your choice," he yelled back, his professional mask slipping entirely. "I'm going to be a surgeon, Carol. I'm going to make 6 figures, maybe 7 figures eventually. I need someone who can match that level of success, someone who can contribute to my career instead of holding it back." "Holding it back?" I whispered. "David, I made your career possible. Every textbook, every lab fee, every month you didn't have to work because you could focus on studying. That was me. I invested $50,000 in your education." "Investment implies expecting a return," David said coldly. "This wasn't an investment, Carol. It was charity. And frankly, I'm tired of feeling guilty about accepting your charity just because you thought it meant we'd get married someday." The word charity shattered something inside me. 5 years of love, of believing in us, of sacrificing everything for our shared future, and he called it charity. I looked at this man I'd loved since I was 19, this man I'd shaped my entire adult life around, and I didn't recognize him at all. "Dr. Gray was right," David continued, and I realized with horror that he'd been discussing our relationship with his colleagues. "She said I was being held back by someone who couldn't grow with me. I deserve someone who can contribute to my success instead of just existing in my life." I stood up slowly, rain still dripping from my hair onto the floor. "Get out," I said quietly. "What?" "Get out of my apartment. Right now." My voice was steady, but inside I was collapsing. David looked genuinely surprised. "Carol, be reasonable. We can still be friends." "Get out," I screamed, 5 years of suppressed pain erupting at once. "Take your designer suits and your medical journals and your superiority complex and get out of my life. For the first time in months." David looked uncertain, but only for a moment. Then he shrugged, went to the bedroom, and started packing his things into the expensive luggage I'd bought him for his residency interviews. As he gathered his belongings, everything I'd helped pay for over the years, I sat on the couch and felt my entire life crumble around me. 26 years old, no savings, no degree, no career prospects, and no future with the man I'd built my whole life around. The first month after David left was the darkest period of my life. I called in sick to both jobs for 3 straight days, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our relationship, and wondering how I'd been so blind. The apartment felt enormous and hollow, without David's medical books and equipment cluttering every surface. Aunt Rosa found me on day 4, using her spare key when I didn't answer her calls. She took one look at me, unwashed, surrounded by tissues and empty food containers, and immediately went into crisis mode. Without saying a word, she opened all the blinds, started a load of laundry, and made coffee strong enough to wake the dead. "Mija," she said, sitting on the edge of my bed with 2 steaming cups. "Tell me everything." So I did. I told her about the breakup, about David calling my love charity, about Dr. Grayand, the embarrassment I'd apparently been to his career. I told her how stupid I felt for believing in our future, how completely I'd lost myself in someone else's dreams. Rosa listened without judgment, occasionally murmuring supportive words in Spanish, her face growing harder with each detail. "That boy," she said finally, "is going to learn what it means to lose something valuable. But right now, we need to focus on you." She was right, though I couldn't imagine how to rebuild a life I'd never really built in the first place. The practical problems hit immediately. Without David's resident salary contributing to rent, I couldn't afford our apartment alone. I gave notice and moved back in with Rosa, packing my few belongings into boxes that showed exactly how little I'd accumulated during 5 years of supporting someone else's life. Work became my refuge and my torment. At Fashion Forward, I folded clothes and rang up customers while fighting back tears. At Murphy's, I served coffee to college students David's age, remembering when I'd been young and optimistic too. My managers at both jobs noticed my distraction but were kind enough not to comment. I'd been a reliable employee for years. They gave me space to grieve. The worst part was running into people who knew us as a couple. David's former study partners, professors from the medical school, even patients' families I'd met during hospital visits. They'd ask how Dr. Martinez and his girlfriend were doing. I'd mumble something about being busy and change the subject, too ashamed to explain that the girlfriend had been discarded once her usefulness expired. Rosa insisted I start therapy. "You need to talk to someone who isn't family," she said firmly. "Someone who can help you understand that this isn't your fault." I resisted at first. Therapy was expensive, and I was already struggling financially. But Rosa had already researched sliding-scale counselors and made me an appointment. Dr. Patricia Williams was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who specialized in relationships and self-esteem. In our first session, I tried to minimize what had happened, suggesting maybe David was right about our incompatibility. Dr. Williams stopped me mid-sentence. "Carol, let me understand this correctly. You supported a man financially and emotionally for 5 years, enabling him to achieve his professional dreams, and when he no longer needed your support, he discarded you while claiming your contributions were worthless?" Her bluntness shocked me. "When you put it like that, it sounds like financial and emotional abuse," she finished, which is exactly what it was. Those sessions forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding. I'd been so focused on being the perfect supportive girlfriend that I'd completely lost myself. I had no hobbies, no friendships independent of David, no plans for my own future. I'd become a satellite orbiting his life, existing only in relation to his needs and goals. "What do you want, Carol?" Dr. Williams asked during our 4th session. "Not what you wanted with David, not what you think you should want. What do you want?" I sat in silence for 10 minutes, genuinely unable to answer. It had been so long since I'd considered my own desires that I'd forgotten how to identify them. That night, I started a journal, writing down small things that made me feel curious or excited. A news article about renewable energy, a coding tutorial that popped up in an online ad, a documentary about women entrepreneurs. Slowly, very slowly, I began to remember the person I'd been before David, the 19-year-old who'd wanted to help people, who'd been fascinated by problem-solving, who'd dreamed of making a difference in the world. She was still in there somewhere, buried under years of making herself smaller to accommodate someone else's expanding ego. The anger came later, in waves that surprised me with their intensity. I'd be folding sweaters at Fashion Forward when suddenly I'd be furious about the $47,000 I'd calculated I'd spent on David's education. I'd be taking an order at Murphy's and remember his comment about French fry grease, and I'd have to excuse myself to rage cry in the bathroom. But anger, I learned, was progress. It meant I was starting to value myself enough to be outraged at how I'd been treated. 6 months after David left, I was browsing the internet during my break at Fashion Forward when an ad for a coding bootcamp caught my attention. Change your life in 12 weeks, from zero to software developer. Normally, I would have scrolled past, but something made me click through to their website. The testimonials were from people like me, career changers, single mothers, people who'd hit rock bottom and decided to rebuild. One woman had left an abusive marriage and learned to code at 32. Another had been laid off from retail management and now worked remotely for a tech startup. Their stories resonated with something deep inside me. I spent my entire lunch break researching the program. It was intensive, 12 weeks, full-time, covering everything from basic programming concepts to building actual applications. The cost was substantial, $8,000, but they offered income-based repayment plans. More importantly, their job placement rate was 93% within 6 months of graduation. That evening, I mentioned it casually to Rosa over dinner. "There's this coding program I've been looking at," I said, expecting her to remind me about our tight budget. Instead, her face lit up. "Mija, you used to love fixing things, remember? When you were little, you'd take apart every electronic device in the house just to see how it worked." I had forgotten that about myself. The curiosity, the satisfaction of solving puzzles, the way I'd always been drawn to understanding how systems functioned. The application process was rigorous. I had to complete several online challenges, write essays about my goals, and do a video interview with an instructor. As I worked through the coding exercises, something clicked. The logical structure, the cause and effect relationships, the way you could build something functional from nothing. It felt like coming home to a part of myself I'd lost. I got accepted 2 weeks later. The program would start in January, just over a year after David had walked out of my life. I gave notice at both jobs, despite Rosa's protests that I should keep one as backup income. But I knew that if I was going to do this, I had to commit completely. Half measures had gotten me into trouble before. The first week of boot camp was overwhelming. I was surrounded by people who seemed naturally gifted with technology. Recent college graduates who'd been coding since high school. Engineers making career transitions. Even a few people with computer science degrees who wanted to learn practical skills. I felt out of place and underprepared. But as the weeks progressed, I discovered something interesting. My years of customer service, of managing multiple jobs, of solving problems under pressure, they'd given me skills my classmates didn't have. When we worked on team projects, I was the one who could communicate complex ideas clearly. When deadlines got tight, I was the one who stayed calm and organized. I wasn't the most technically gifted student, but I was determined and resourceful. The breakthrough came during week 8 when we had to build our first full application. I chose to create a tool for restaurant workers, a scheduling app that would help servers and kitchen staff coordinate shifts and communicate with management. I drew from my years at Murphy's, understanding exactly what pain points the app needed to solve. My instructor Marcus was a former Google developer who'd left the corporate world to teach. He pulled me aside after I presented my project. "Carol, this is really impressive work. But more than that, you've identified a genuine market need and built something that actually solves it. Have you thought about what you want to do after graduation?" I hadn't really. I'd been so focused on just getting through the program that I hadn't looked beyond finding some entry-level developer job. But Marcus's words planted a seed. What if I could turn my restaurant scheduling app into a real business? The last month of boot camp, I worked obsessively on improving the application. I reached out to former coworkers at Murphy's and other restaurants around town, getting feedback on features and user interface. I learned about databases, cloud hosting, and mobile app development. I even started researching business licenses and startup costs. On graduation day, as I walked across the stage to receive my certificate, I thought about how different this felt from David's medical school graduation. This achievement was mine alone, earned through my own hard work, funded with my own determination, built on skills I'd discovered within myself. No one could take this away from me or diminish my role in making it happen. Rosa cried harder than I did during the ceremony. "I'm so proud of you, Mija," she whispered as we hugged afterward. "You found yourself again." She was right. For the first time in years, I felt like I knew exactly who Carol was and what she was capable of. 3 months after graduating from the boot camp, my restaurant scheduling app, which I'd named ShiftSync, had gained traction beyond my wildest expectations. What started as a solution for Murphy's Diner had expanded to 12 restaurants across the city, with owners praising how it reduced scheduling conflicts and improved staff communication. The app's success surprised everyone, including me. Restaurant managers loved the intuitive interface, servers appreciated being able to swap shifts easily, and owners saw immediate improvements in staff satisfaction and operational efficiency. Word spread through the tight-knit restaurant community faster than I could have imagined. I was running the business from Rosa's kitchen table, handling customer support calls between coding sessions, and managing a growing list of feature requests. The income was modest but steady, enough to cover my basic expenses and start paying Rosa back for supporting me during the boot camp months. That's when Marcus, my former instructor, reached out with an opportunity that would change everything. His friend Jake Rodriguez owned a small tech consulting firm downtown and was looking for a junior developer to join his team. More importantly, Jake was intrigued by ShiftSync and wanted to discuss a potential partnership. The meeting took place at Jake's office in the downtown tech district, a converted warehouse space with exposed brick walls, standing desks, and the kind of creative energy I'd never experienced in retail or restaurant work. Jake was in his early 40s, a former software engineer who'd built his consulting firm by focusing on practical solutions for small businesses. "I've been watching what you've done with ShiftSync," Jake said as we sat in his conference room, my laptop open to demonstrate the app's latest features. "It's exactly the kind of innovation this city's service industry needs. Have you considered scaling it beyond restaurants?" I hadn't, but as Jake talked, possibilities opened up in my mind. Hotels could use similar scheduling tools. Retail stores struggled with the same shift management issues. Even healthcare facilities needed better ways to coordinate staff schedules. The core technology could be adapted for multiple industries. "I'd like to propose a partnership," Jake continued. "You keep ownership of ShiftSync, but we provide technical infrastructure, marketing support, and business development resources. In exchange, we take a small percentage of revenue, and you work with our consulting team on other projects to support yourself while the app grows." It was exactly what I needed. Validation from an established business, resources to scale ShiftSync properly, and steady income while building something larger. We shook hands that afternoon, and I started work the following Monday. Working with Jake's team was like discovering a new language I'd been meant to speak all along. My colleagues were brilliant developers and designers, but they valued my practical experience and user-focused approach. For the first time in my professional life, I felt like an equal contributor, rather than someone grateful to be included. Within 6 months, ShiftSync had expanded to 45 restaurants and small businesses across 2 states. We'd added features for payroll integration, time tracking, and employee communication that made the platform valuable for service industry managers. Revenue grew steadily from hundreds of dollars per month to a consistent $8,000 monthly. Jake insisted I attend a regional tech conference that fall to present ShiftSync as a case study in practical application development. Standing on that stage, explaining how I'd identified a real-world problem and built a solution that helped working people's lives, I felt a pride and purpose I'd never experienced during my years of supporting David's dreams. The audience was filled with small business owners, local entrepreneurs, and regional tech professionals, people who understood the value of practical solutions over flashy innovations. I found myself fielding thoughtful questions about user experience and sustainable business growth, holding my own in conversations about serving underrepresented markets. After my presentation, several people approached with business cards and collaboration ideas. A few local business groups wanted to discuss partnerships. Some restaurant chains expressed interest in customized versions of the platform. A regional business development organization invited me to join their entrepreneur mentorship program. For the first time since David had dismissed me as professionally worthless, I had options, real options, based on skills I'd developed and value I'd created independently. That evening, back in my hotel room, I looked at my reflection and barely recognized the confident woman staring back at me. I was 28 years old, running a profitable tech business, and surrounded by people who respected my expertise. The scared, diminished person who'd watched David walk away 2 years earlier felt like someone from another lifetime. I'd built something meaningful from nothing, and this time, no one could take credit for my success or claim I was holding them back. I learned about David's downfall the same way I learned most news these days, through LinkedIn notifications and local medical community gossip that filtered through my expanding professional network. It was 18 months after our last contact, and I was reviewing quarterly revenue reports for ShiftSync when Rosa called, her voice tight with barely contained satisfaction. "Mija, you need to see today's newspaper," she said. Your ex-doctor is on the front page of the Metro section. The article was devastating in its clinical precision. Dr. David Martinez, surgical resident at Metropolitan General Hospital, had been involved in a serious medical error during what should have been a routine appendectomy. According to the investigation, David had been working his third consecutive double shift when he made a critical mistake, nicking the patient's bowel during the procedure and failing to recognize the error before closing. The patient, a 42-year-old father of 3, had developed sepsis and spent 2 weeks in intensive care. While he eventually recovered, the incident triggered a comprehensive review of David's recent performance. The investigation revealed a pattern of corner cutting, inadequate preparation, and what the chief of surgery called dangerous overconfidence in his abilities. But the real destruction came from what they discovered during the disciplinary hearing. David had been falsifying some of his required training hours, claiming credit for procedures he'd only observed, and had been involved in a romantic relationship with Dr. Alicia Gray while she was his supervising resident, a clear violation of hospital policy that compromised patient safety protocols. The medical board's final report was scathing. David lost his medical license permanently, with the possibility of appeal only after 5 years and completion of extensive retraining. Metropolitan General terminated his residency immediately. The patient's family filed a malpractice lawsuit seeking $2 million in damages. I read the article twice, feeling a complex mix of emotions I hadn't expected. There was no satisfaction in seeing David's life collapse, just a hollow recognition that his arrogance and shortcuts had finally caught up with him. The man who'd once looked down on my simple work had proven incapable of handling the responsibilities he'd claimed to deserve. Jake found me in the break room an hour later, staring at my phone with the article still open. "Everything okay?" he asked, settling into the chair across from me with his usual concerned expression. "Just some news about someone from my past," I said, showing him the headline. "Remember that guy I mentioned once? The one who said I was holding back his medical career?" Jake read silently, his eyebrows rising with each paragraph. "Wow. Carol, this is actually really sad. Not just the career stuff, but what led to it. This guy clearly never learned the value of integrity or genuine preparation." He was right. David's downfall wasn't really about one surgical error. It was about years of taking shortcuts, believing his own hype, and assuming success was owed to him rather than earned through careful work and ethical behavior. The same attitude that had let him dismiss my contributions so callously had eventually undermined his professional competence. Over the following weeks, more details emerged through the medical community grapevine. David had been living well beyond his resident salary, accumulating credit card debt to maintain the lifestyle he thought a future surgeon deserved. The designer suits, expensive restaurants, and luxury apartment had been financed through borrowed money, based on expectations of income that would now never materialize. Dr. Alicia Gray had also faced disciplinary action for the inappropriate relationship, though she managed to keep her medical license. According to hospital staff who spoke off the record, she'd distanced herself from David immediately after the investigation began, claiming he'd pursued her despite her better judgment. The woman David had thought represented his ticket to medical elite circles had abandoned him as quickly as he'd once abandoned me. The most painful detail came from a mutual acquaintance who'd stayed in touch with David's parents. His mother had called Rosa, crying, asking if she knew how David could rebuild his life. Apparently, he'd moved back to his parents' house in Texas, completely broken, with no clear path forward and mounting legal bills from the malpractice case. "It's tragic," Rosa told me after hanging up from that call. "But Mija, it's also justice. Not because you wanted revenge, but because actions have consequences. The way he treated people, the shortcuts he took, the lies he told himself about deserving success without earning it, it all caught up with him." I found myself thinking about the conversation David and I might have had if we'd stayed together. Would I have noticed the warning signs of his professional recklessness? Would I have continued enabling his sense of entitlement? Or would I have found the strength to demand better from him? I'd never know, but I suspected the answer would have involved more years of making myself smaller to accommodate his expanding ego. Instead, I was sitting in my own office downtown, reviewing contracts for Shift Sync's expansion into the hotel industry, surrounded by business awards and speaking invitations that represented my actual worth in the professional world. David's fall hadn't made me successful. My own work had done that. But it certainly confirmed that walking away from me had been the biggest mistake of his life. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, almost 3 years after David had walked out of my life. I was reviewing user analytics for ShiftSync's latest update when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Usually I let unknown calls go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Carol." The voice was hesitant, barely recognizable. It's David. I nearly dropped my phone. In 3 years, he hadn't attempted any contact. No calls, no texts, no social media messages. The silence had been complete, which made this sudden communication feel surreal. David. I kept my voice neutral, professional. How did you get this number? I called Murphy's. The manager there gave it to me. Of course he had. Jerry, the longtime manager, still remembered David from our dating years. Carol, could we talk? In person, I mean. I know I have no right to ask, but it's important. Every instinct told me to hang up. This man had devastated me, called my love charity, dismissed my worth in the cruelest possible terms. But curiosity won out over caution. Where are you? I'm in town for a few days, staying at the Budget Inn on 5th Street. The Budget Inn. David, who'd once complained about the thread count of our sheets, was staying at the cheapest motel in the city. Could you meet me somewhere? Anywhere you want, just for coffee. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him that afternoon at Cornerstone Cafe, a trendy spot downtown near my office. I arrived early and chose a table by the window where I could see him coming. I wanted every advantage in this conversation. David walked in 10 minutes late, and I barely recognized him. The confident, well-dressed resident I remembered had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely defeated. His clothes were clean but obviously inexpensive. His hair needed cutting, and he'd lost weight in a way that made him look gaunt rather than healthy. Most striking were his eyes. The arrogance that had once defined his expression was completely gone. Carol. He approached the table cautiously, like I might bolt at any moment. Thank you for agreeing to see me. You look incredible. I did look good, and I knew it. Professional success had given me confidence that showed in everything from my posture to my wardrobe. I was wearing a tailored blazer that cost more than David's entire outfit, and my business cards were scattered on the table from a lunch meeting with potential investors. What do you want, David? I asked without preamble. I'd learned not to waste time on social pleasantries with people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with my kindness. He sat down heavily, ordering coffee with hands that shook slightly. I want to apologize. For everything. For the way I treated you, the things I said, the way I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me. The words sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced them. But there was genuine pain in his voice, a brokenness that 3 years ago would have made me want to comfort him. Now it just made me curious about what had prompted this sudden attack of conscience. I heard about your medical license, I said gently. I'm sorry that happened. David's face crumpled. Carol, I lost everything. My career, my reputation, my future. The malpractice lawsuit took every penny I had, plus money I didn't have. I'm 31 years old, living with my parents, working at a medical supply warehouse for $12 an hour. He continued talking, words spilling out like he'd been holding them back for months. He told me about the investigation, about Alicia dropping him the moment things got difficult, about how his former colleagues wouldn't return his calls. He talked about the shame, the depression, the complete collapse of the life he'd thought he deserved. But the worst part, he said, finally meeting my eyes, was realizing that I'd thrown away the one person who actually loved me for who I was. You supported me when I had nothing, Carol. You believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself, and I repaid you by treating you like you were worthless. I listened without interrupting, studying this broken version of the man who'd once been my entire world. Part of me felt sympathy for his obvious pain, but a larger part recognized this performance for what it was. Not genuine remorse, but desperation. What exactly are you asking for, David? I asked when he finished talking. I'm asking for a second chance, he said, reaching across the table like he might try to touch my hand. I moved mine to my lap. I know I hurt you terribly, and I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But Carol, we were good together once. We understood each other. We had plans. We had plans, I agreed. And you threw them away the moment something better came along. There was never anything better, he insisted. Alicia? The whole medical school crowd? The status thing? It was all shallow nonsense. You were real, Carol. What we had was real. I sat back in my chair, processing his words. 3 years ago, hearing David say he'd made a mistake, that he still loved me, that he wanted another chance, it would have felt like vindication. Now it just felt like manipulation. David, are you asking me to take you back because you love me, or because you need someone to take care of you again? The question hung in the air between us. David opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The truth was written all over his face. David's inability to answer my question told me everything I needed to know. I watched him struggle with the truth, that his sudden desire for reconciliation had nothing to do with love and everything to do with his need for financial and emotional rescue. "Carol, it's not like that," he finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I mean, yes, my life is difficult right now, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I finally understand what I lost. I understand what you meant to me." "No." "David," I said calmly, "you understand what I did for you. There's a difference." I pulled out my phone and showed him ShiftSync's website, scrolling through client testimonials and our service area map. His eyes widened as he took in the steady growth metrics and professional photos of me speaking at regional business events. "This is what I built after you left," I told him. "My own company, serving an industry I actually understand because I worked in it. We now serve over 200 businesses across 4 states, and I'm making more money in a month than I used to make in 6 months of double shifts." David stared at the screen, and I could see him calculating numbers, recognizing the level of success that had once seemed impossible for someone like me. "Carol, this is incredible. I always knew you were smart. You just didn't think I was smart enough for your world," I finished. "The world you thought you deserved to be part of, even though you hadn't earned your place in it." The harshness of my words made him flinch, but I wasn't interested in protecting his feelings anymore. "David, do you know what I've learned about success? Real success isn't about impressing other people or fitting into their idea of who deserves what. It's about finding problems you can solve and solving them better than anyone else. It's about integrity, persistence, and genuine value creation." I gestured around the cafe, which was full of professionals from the downtown business district. Every person in this room knows my name now, not because of who I'm dating or what degree I have, but because I built something useful. That's the difference between earned success and entitled expectations. David was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. When he finally spoke, his voice was small. "I made a terrible mistake, Carol. I thought I was choosing a better life, but I was really just choosing empty status symbols over someone who actually cared about me." "You did make a terrible mistake," I agreed, "but not the one you think. Your mistake wasn't leaving me, David. Your mistake was never learning how to value people properly, starting with yourself." I stood up, gathering my things. This conversation was over. "David, I genuinely hope you figure out how to rebuild your life in a way that's based on who you really are instead of who you think you should be. But that journey doesn't include me." "Carol, please," he said desperately, half rising from his chair. "I know I don't deserve another chance, but couldn't we at least try to be friends? I miss having you in my life." "You miss having someone take care of you," I corrected gently. "That's not friendship, David. That's dependency." As I walked toward the door, David called after me one last time. "Carol, I'm sorry. I'm truly, genuinely sorry for everything." I turned back to look at him. This broken man who'd once made me feel worthless, who'd called my love charity, who'd been so sure I wasn't good enough for his future. "I believe you are sorry," I said. "But David, sorry doesn't rebuild the trust you destroyed. Sorry doesn't give me back the years I spent making myself smaller so you could feel bigger. Sorry is just a word." I walked back to my office through the downtown district I now called home, past restaurants where business colleagues waved from window tables, past the tech incubator where I mentored other entrepreneurs, past the coffee shop where I'd be meeting with venture capital investors the following week. That evening, I called Rosa to tell her about the encounter. "How do you feel, Mija?" she asked after I'd recounted the entire conversation. "Grateful," I said, and meant it. If David hadn't left, I never would have discovered what I was capable of. I would have spent my whole life supporting someone else's dreams instead of building my own. 6 months later, ShiftSync had grown to serve over 200 businesses across 4 states. Our monthly revenue had reached a steady $40,000, which meant my personal income was finally at a level I'd never dreamed of, around $15,000 per month after business expenses and taxes. For the first time in my life, I had genuine financial security. I wasn't wealthy by any measure, but I was comfortable. I could afford a nice 1-bedroom apartment downtown. I could eat at restaurants without checking prices, and I had savings growing in my account every month. Most importantly, I was building something sustainable that served working people like I'd once been. David, according to mutual acquaintances, eventually found work as a medical equipment sales representative, using his medical knowledge in a different way, but earning a modest salary that barely covered his student loan payments and living expenses. I heard he'd moved to a small town in Texas and was slowly trying to rebuild his reputation in healthcare support roles. As for me, I continued growing ShiftSync while maintaining a sustainable work-life balance. I spoke at local business conferences about entrepreneurship and mentored other women making career transitions through the community college's business development program. I bought a reliable car and took weekend trips to nearby cities, enjoying freedoms I'd never had during my restaurant working days. The business provided me with exactly what I'd always wanted. Not massive wealth, but enough income to live without financial stress, work on projects that mattered to me, and help other people improve their working conditions. I earned more in a month now than I used to make in 6 months of double shifts, and every dollar felt genuinely earned through value I'd created. Sometimes I thought about the 26-year-old woman who'd watched David walk out of her life, devastated and convinced her future was over. I wished I could tell her that the worst day of her life would turn out to be the beginning of financial independence, that losing someone who didn't value her would teach her to value herself, and that the dreams she'd deferred would eventually grow into steady, meaningful success. The price of David's ingratitude had been steep. It cost him the love of someone who would have supported him through anything, and it cost him the chance to be part of a genuinely successful partnership. But for me, that same ingratitude had been the catalyst for discovering I could build a comfortable life on my own terms. In the end, we both got exactly what we deserved. He got the consequences of his choices, and I got the financial security and self-respect I'd always worked for.